Welcome back to Just Liberty, where justice and liberty meet. I'm Bettina Krause, editor of Liberty Magazine, and I'm here with the one and only Alan Reinach, president of the Church State Council, and my greatly esteemed co host on this adventure that we are on together, Alan, to try to take back religious liberty from the political extremes. You know, it's interesting, Alan, because I did not grow up in America. And so I did not receive the history lessons about Jefferson and Madison and the constitutional founding era that I'm sure most of our listeners did receive. And so that's why I'm particularly excited today to talk to our guest, who's really going to delve into what is often a misunderstood and often misportrayed area of our history as a nation. So, Alan, I'm going to let you dive on in and introduce our guests for today.
We are very happy to welcome to Just Liberty Today Professor Steve Green. Steve is a law professor at Willamette University in Washington State, Fred H. Paulus Professor of Law and Affiliated Professor of History and Religious Studies. And I think I've known Steve since at least the early 90s, if not before. But he's a prolific author. Most recent, The Eighth, is what we're going to be talking about today, the grand collaboration. Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and the invention of American religious freedom. Now, I think my first question, Steve, is Americans didn't fully invent religious freedom, did we? Was there religious freedom before the founders? And then what did they do differently?
Yeah. Um, Thanks for inviting me back. It's always good to be on your program. The subtitle is actually intentionally provocative because I knew I'd get some pushback from all my friends in the religious history community. Um, Nicholas Miller would be one of the first ones who I think, and he's written some really good works where he talks about the Protestant origins of American religious liberty. I think it's what the title of his book is. And I did it purposely because my point was, and I say it in the introduction, I'm very clear, that the basis for the concepts of American religious freedom, and whether we get into this or not, I make a distinction between religious liberty and religious freedom, the second being a larger, more captious concept in my mind. That the roots of that certainly predate James Madison, Thomas Jefferson, and the founding period. They built upon the foundations that so many people within the dissenting Protestant tradition, within the Jewish tradition, and then Enlightenment scholars and Whig scholars all were talking about this for years and years and years. The reason I say this is because it was trying to kind of be the segue into the debate. Not that I'm writing a dual biography, the purpose of necessarily going into current debates, but the segue to the debate about the importance of Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, and how even though the court has continued to refer to them, and certainly did in the earlier cases in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, they have now fell to disfavor among certainly religious conservatives, political conservatives. And so the reason I use that title was to basically say, like it or not, the regime of American religious freedom we have today is attributable primarily to Thomas Jefferson and James Madison's contributions to it. You may disagree with it. You may think it's the best thing ever. But when it comes down to it, this is what the Supreme Court focused on starting in the 1940s. And if you disagree, they have been the boogeyman that you have continually tried to marginalize. And so that's why I say that.
So, what I found fascinating about your book, and one of the reasons I enjoyed it so much, is that you are bringing that historical microscope, I guess, to bear on these two giants of the founding era, Madison and Jefferson. And you're really delving deep into the primary material, which is their correspondence. And I'm wondering, first of all, what led you to do this sort of in-depth study? I think it's the first time you've really taken on sort of a book of this kind where you're really delving into that sort of personal relationship aspect of these figures rather than dealing with more the intellectual aspects of what what they stood for? So what led you to do that?
I appreciate the question. As Alan noted, we've known each other for 30 some odd years now, and we've been working on these issues for a long time. Um, and yeah, this is my eighth book. I've written about 60 articles and book chapters. I've done numerous briefs at various levels of courts. And in my career, I've referenced Jefferson and Madison more times than I can remember. And all of us have, to a certain extent. And in writing my previous book about separating church and state, a history, where I kind of just give an overview of the development and separation of church and state. In writing that several years ago, when I was going back and just looking at the literature, et cetera, that you rely on when you're writing a book, it occurred to me that there are more than a dozen, I would say, biographies each of Jefferson Madison, freestanding biographies. There are a handful, about 3 or 4 dual biographies of the two men. All of those works, to one degree or another, will, of course, talk something about their commitment to religious freedom, to separation of church and state. But what I realized is there was not a dual biography that was solely focused on this question, which to a certain extent is probably could be considered almost their greatest contribution to American to the republic, to our experience, has been this. And all historians at some point in time, I think, get intrigued about writing a biography. It's just kind of like you got to check that box off before it's your bucket list. And so I just saw it as an opportunity to do this. And one of the things that was rewarding and refreshing, and I entered into this with some trepidation, was, well, I've been citing Jefferson Madison for 30 years. And if I do a real deep dive, what am I going to find? Is it going to be something that really contradicts what I have previously claimed was their positions on these issues? Fortunately, I really did not find anything that really contradicted. I actually found information that reinforced. Um, Part of the advantage of doing this book when I did, a friend of mine, John Ragosta at the Monticello Center, he actually turned me onto this several years ago, was that there's a new, no longer new, relatively new National Archives site that had gone and digitized all of the various collections that have existed for the last 150 years, so to speak, of the various papers. And one of the problems with doing this kind of historical research is you do have some of the great collections that have been written over the years, but they don't necessarily always have everything. And so you have to go to the next collection and the next collection. And my university had a couple of these series, but does not have everything. And I was sitting here thinking, oh my God, I'm going to have to go around and find every single collection so I can find every single letter. This is now on the National Archives digitized webpage. And so compared to when I went to working on my PhD in the 90s, this is just amazing because you just plug in words and you get. Anyway, long story short, they had approximately 2,300 letters back and forth. And I can't tell you how many of those I looked at, but I tried to look at every single one that they talked in any way about religion, religious issues, faith, etc., and see how they interacted. And again, the title to the book is The Grand Collaboration, how they reinforced and collaborated each other's perspectives. And all of that, to a certain extent, was new for me to take that approach.
Was there something in particular that jumped out at you that you learned that was, significant to what had already been, so to speak, in the public record, things well known? There's Madison's memorial and remonstrance, his petition against government funding, and, of course, Jefferson's statute for religious freedom, and so much more that we always go to as our first go-to. but was there something in particular that really jumped out at you from what you learned from the letters?
How, one thing that jumped out at me was that, again, I think in all the work I've done, what you've done, Alan, and stuff that's so we've been in Liberty Magazine. We refer to them all the time and have kind of elevated them to the upper levels of the pantheon of this. But of how central this issue was for them, that was something that I was not surprised, but it was reinforcing and reaffirming that this really was one of their central issues. And the question I asked at the beginning of the book is, why would two men who were highly educated for the time, were basically religiously heterodox, even though they kept an affiliation with the Anglican Church, were really not, practitioners in a sense, disputed a lot of the contents of the Bible, particularly Jefferson, when he went through and cut and paste and got out his scissors and created his own version of the Bible. Why would they go to the mat? Why would this be this central issue in their lives? And I say, particularly when there were just so many other issues at this point in time in our history about creating this new nation. I mean, Madison in the first Congress, he finally shows up. Not finally shows. He gets there early, and he's at the first Congress, and he introduces his proposals for the Bill of Rights in early June, and most of the rest of the members of the House say, forget it. We're not be concerned about that. We need to be concerned about how do we establish the various branches of government? How do we establish a tax policy? How do we do this? The reason I mention that is there were so many issues about governance, and so much was on the table. This was creating a government almost out of whole cloth. Why did they then concentrate so much on these issues? And to me, that's a
And the
fast
answer?
Yeah, don't leave us with
the
a cliffhanger.
central I think the central motivating factor for me was this belief in free inquiry. Let your mind go where the empirical evidence leads it. And freedom of inquiry, freedom of thought was most evident in freedom of religion, freedom of conscience. And they saw that that was where the progress of humankind would go if we take away the constraints on freedom of conscience and freedom of inquiry. And this is what had been, if anything, one of the main indicias of the religious establishments at that period of time. And so religious establishments were the worst example, if I say the best example of the worst of the powers that be trying to constrain people's ability to think for themselves. And so they weren't necessarily religious. They were never going to be questioned in their own religiosity, except that Jefferson obviously was from his writings because he exposed himself. They weren't like the evangelicals who had to suffer. But still, and even though they didn't identify with the evangelicals personally, they still saw that it was a captious concept that included both people of faith and then maybe free thinkers. And that's what tied it all together.
So,
Well, let me ask, if I may, quickly, Bettina.
uh-huh.
You mentioned the rights of conscience and freedom of conscience. Madison has a famous quote. Well, it's not a famous quote, but we think of the phrase life, liberty, and property, and due process of law that can't be taken away. Madison had a statement that conscience is the most sacred of property, something like that,
Yeah.
form of property. Can you shine a little bit of a spotlight on what you think he meant by that, or how he saw that?
Yeah, it's almost like that quote from Othello in Shakespeare, where Othello says something about, you steal my purse. It was mine, it was yours. Money is transitory. But when you steal my good name, it goes to the core of injuring who I am myself. And yeah, in his writing, that's his piece on corporations that he wrote. And again, a very obscure piece, but still clearly reinforcing that property rights were extremely important, but you can replace your property. You can get more money potentially. But when you deprive people of their core identity of who they are, that may not be replaceable. And so he actually did. He saw that rights of conscience were the most important form of property. And then to take what you're saying, therefore, it needs to have the highest protection. If we talk about due process, and we normally talk about due process as either physical liberty, being imprisoned, or taking of your property without just compensation, those are kind of the more physical things. But Madison saw that it was rights of conscience. You take that away, then that cannot be replaced. And so it was the most important form of property for him.
So I'm interested here because we're talking about sort of highfalutin ideas, philosophical ideas, and this commitment to these Lockean ideals. But how much do you think was actually driven by a more pragmatic concern, which was wariness or suspicion of religious enthusiasms and the trouble that they could cause if they meddled in government? Because I know personally, I mean, you bring this out in your book, both Jefferson and Madison didn't. They didn't have an affinity for the Baptists or the Presbyterians, who they saw as a little bit too enthusiastic in their faith. Do you think some of what they were trying to do was to insulate the government from harm from religious enthusiasm?
Short answer, yes. I think
Uh,
you're right. Now, Madison was educated at Princeton, which is Presbyterian college, and John Witherspoon was a moderate evangelical, but also had his students read David Hume and Adam Smith and read the more enlightenment oriented people. And so consequently, Madison had that type of education. To kind of go back to Alan's question, I mean, there were some differences, and this is how they complement themselves. Jefferson was more anti-clerical than Madison. Madison, he was actually on the board of Hampton Sidney College, which is a small Presbyterian college in Virginia. His brother went there, and so he always had somewhat of an affinity for them. Jefferson hated Presbyterians. He called them he said they were the most intolerant sect ever. And part of it was that they actually tried to circumvent his founding of the University of Virginia as the first truly secular university in the country. And they basically looked around and said, well, the Anglicans have William and Mary. We want this new University of Virginia, and we're going to impose Calvinist doctrine in it. And he really disliked them. In fact, he went so far as in one of his drafts of a constitution for the Commonwealth of Virginia that never got approved in the early 1780s, I think it was, he actually puts in the exclusion of clergy from holding public office. He runs this by Madison, and you see Madison writing back to him and saying, I don't think this is a good idea. If you're truly going to believe in freedom of conscience and that people should not in any way be discriminated against or subject to, whatever, as a result of their religious faith, I think you need to take this out. And Madison convinced Jefferson to remove that provision from his proposed constitution. And so, even though I think theologically they were very similar, Madison was more willing to kind of let things go along. And so he wasn't bothered as much by the evangelical movement as Jefferson was. But Jefferson, partially because he was also singled out, probably more than anybody in the founding period, for his faith. He was attacked, or lack thereof, yeah. He was attacked. And which that is a true misnomer too. Even though they both had what you might want to call deistic leanings, they doubted the miracles. They doubted the virgin birth. Maybe they doubted the resurrection. They still, both of them, and particularly Jefferson, because we know a lot more about Jefferson's beliefs, that he did believe in a God.
Hmm.
And he did believe that Christianity, in a sense, but certainly religion, had been abused by the history of the church, and that they kept themselves in power by emphasizing miracles, emphasizing things that were really not truly biblical. But I can't say either of them were really, as Alan suggested, that people did claim. He was called a raving atheist when he ran in 1800, and he was not.
So, Steve, the Jefferson in particular has come under attack, along with the separation of church and state idea. And I think that, if we're going to do anything with this show today, with this discussion, we need to make sure we cover what exactly did Jefferson and Madison contribute in the Establishment Clause, a prohibition on religious establishments, which effectively created the separation of church and state, something that we've always said is what the Constitution does, not what it says. Talk about their views of church-state separation.
Yeah. This is actually another thing that I think you could say was a slight difference between the two, but was something that complemented each other on this. Jefferson more was concerned about, again, kind of the corruption of the church and the church corrupting the state. You do see in Madison's writings, he was a little more balanced. He said, I'm also concerned about the government corrupting religion, as well as religion corrupting the state. But in either way, they did not see that a regime of what I call secularity, and I make a distinction between that and secularism, like fundamentalism. It's not an ism, but a regime of secularity would be the one where religion could flourish the best. And back to what Kristen Patino was asking, is a really good question. Didn't get quite through with it. Madison actually saw the greatest danger to religious freedom and personal religious liberty as actually not necessarily coming from the government itself. He was really concerned that if they take on religious errors, if they start promoting any type of religious doctrine, it will not only corrupt religion, as he talks about in his Memorial Remonstrance, but it also will corrupt the state. But he saw the greatest threat actually is coming from religious factions
Hmm.
and religious majorities who would beat up, combine, and then beat up unreligious minorities. And he saw that as actually the greatest protection for true religious freedom, was that you had a diversity of sects, as he says in Federalist 51. And consequently, that will then keep a balance that will exist. And so he emphasized a little bit more the value of religious pluralism than Jefferson did. And I'm not saying Jefferson disagreed with that so much, but his points of emphasis, you do see him saying that. Okay. They saw all of this as being implicit in the separation of church and state. Keep the government out of religion, keep religion out of the government. You're right. The Jeffersonian/Madisonian vision of church-state separation has clearly come under attack in the last 30 years. One of the things, as a practicing lawyer, as we were talking offline, I'm working on 3 briefs at the moment at the U.S. Supreme Court. What is ironic is this trend we've seen now for the last 10 years where the court is, I think, overemphasizing what they call a history and traditions approach to resolving the First Amendment as well as the Second Amendment and other amendments, but certainly in the First Amendment area. And so they're saying we need to go back and basically find out what the original public understanding or public meaning of the religion clauses were. But at the same time they're doing that now, they're also ignoring Madison and Jefferson's contribution to that. And I say in my introduction to the book and in the conclusion of the book, whether you like them or not, no figures contributed more to American religious freedom than Jefferson and Madison. You can't ignore them. But what we see the Supreme Court doing today is, well, let's go back and analogize to Washington's farewell address, where he makes some religious statements, which, by the way, is written by Alexander Hamilton for political reasons, but that's another issue. Okay. Let's do that kind of stuff. And let's kind of ignore the two prominent, most vocal people at the time who were writing about religious freedom in America. And to me, that's just totally off balance, ironic, if not hypocritical.
And we're opening this whole new can of worms here, the current jurisprudence of the court concerning the First Amendment and where that might lead. Maybe let's talk about that. How do you see misconceptions about history playing out in the context of current disputes before the court? I mean,
Okay.
we see things such as funding for religious schools, for instance. I mean, how easy is it to misconstrue, either consciously or unconsciously, the historical record around these issues?
You shouldn't have asked me this question. This is one of my dog and pony. I've written a fair amount about this recently. As a historian, I write a lot about the history of the founding period and since then. I think it informs our intellectual debate about this. It certainly should inform the judicial debate and considerations about this, but it should not be in lockstep. We should not necessarily say, hey, we can go identify at this point in time exactly what they were thinking. I mean, we only have the record we can go on. We only have the information that was written down and then preserved. It's so easy to go back and then do cherry picking in this information, which the current court is just become expert in cherry picking certain phrases, etc., and not necessarily keeping them within the context at the time. I mean, you know this. I mean, there's actually this famous part of the Constitutional Convention where Benjamin Franklin, when there was an impasse, he basically says, "Let's break and have a prayer."
Yeah.
And some Christian nationalists actually say that actually happened, which it did not. It's not in the record anyway that happened. But they don't sit back and kind of think, well, Benjamin Franklin, who was the only self-declared deist at the Constitutional Convention, why would he suggest a prayer? Well, I think part of it was to embarrass some of the members in this particular, at the moment of impasse, and try to kind of say, let's move on and do something else. But I don't think necessarily Benjamin Franklin was trying to necessarily impose his religiosity on people. The point is, any person at any time in our history has said something religiously and something maybe atheistically. You pick and choose which one you want to point out, but that doesn't necessarily make it a consistent thought process of that particular person. And this is part of the problem with originalism. Go ahead.
I gotta jump in here, Steve, because in my undergraduate, um, finishing up my undergraduate degree, I was asked to do like an honors thesis, and I was guided because they knew that I was a Seventh-day Adventist and I was going to law school. I was guided to do a study on the Supreme Court's use of history in the Sunday law cases in the 1961, where you had 100 pages uh, of what's been criticized as law office history. What the listener may ask is law office history. Well, it's history that is written for purposes of supporting a predetermined outcome.
Exactly.
And so when I heard that the Supreme Court had decided that history and tradition were going to be, a primary focus of how we decide religion cases, I'm like, well, that just means that you can, manipulate history to produce whatever outcome you've decided you want. I mean, to some extent, I hear what you're saying, that originalism is kind of a flawed undertaking. And yet here you are going back and really digging deep into what that originalism was, and you and I share a profound appreciation and respect for the principles that Madison and Jefferson did bequeath to us in the First Amendment and, in their writings. So I'm kind of, in some sense, I almost think you're talking out of both sides of your mouth, that we respect the history, and yet, um, I mean, is the problem that the Supreme Court just can't or won't get the history right, or that there's really just a limit to how much we can do modern jurisprudence based on the history?
I think it's both. Those are good questions. I think it's both. Uh, Historians and lawyers, and I wear both hats, um, will use historical record for completely different purposes. And lawyers want to see a particular outcome. They want to see the supporting information behind maybe their preconceived idea of what it is. Historians like to elucidate, to inform, but historians, as I said in my writing, one of the reasons I love wearing my history hat, maybe more than my lawyer hat, is because when I do historical research, I almost always find something new. And it takes me down a different path sometimes, or expands the way I discuss something. You have to be open to that. And so when I write historical briefs in the courts, what I'm trying to say is, to quote Chief Justice Roberts in a case where he didn't follow his own words, history is complex. And it is complex. Maybe we can get some lessons from history, but we also need to understand its complexity, its nuances, and not have it preordain where we are
Hmm.
going.
Its limitations.
Its limitations, yeah.
Is there a certain irony here that the project of originalism is so dependent upon modern technology in terms of mining the record? Isn't that slightly strange?
Yeah, it's become a lot easier, I think, to do
Right.
that. So yeah, I think modern technology has assisted in the originalism project. Um, I mean, Justice Kagan, when she was um, being con- being confirmed, it was before the Senate Judiciary Committee for her confirmation. She made this statement where she said, "Well, to a degree, we are all originalists in that we do value history, and the law itself is very much historically and precedent oriented, right? We build upon the past when it comes to legal principles. And so that's just core with the legal system. And so history does matter. The point is how do we use that history? And in some ways, a 30-page amicus brief or a 50-page merits brief is not the best place to be arguing about this.
So we need to wrap up soon, Steve. It's been a great conversation. But before we go, I just want to know if someone picks up your book, maybe they don't have a law degree, but they have an interest in this historical period, they have an interest in Jefferson and Madison. What do you hope they take away with them? What is the overarching idea that you want your reader to leave with?
I guess I would like them to take away the importance, the significance of this idea of American religious freedom was to them, the commitment that they had to that. The other thing, and one of the ways that more recently people have tried to marginalize Jefferson Madison is say they were outliers. No one really agreed with them, that they were promoting something that so many other people disagreed with. I hope the book will at least demonstrate that no, even though they maybe were at the forefront, they were not outliers. They had significant amount of support in Virginia for what they were trying to promote when it comes to separation. And a lot of that support was from the religious community. It was not an anti-religious concept to want to have religious freedom and separation of church and state. And so I hope they will take that away. And then next time they hear some judge or lawyer bad-mouthing Jefferson and Madison will say, well, wait a minute, I'm not sure that's exactly right.
Great. Thank you so much. It's just been lovely to talk with you and good luck with your book and with the new book that you're currently working on.
Thanks so much. It's good to see you both.
But Tina, there's so much that Steve Green shared that was so valuable about this history and its relevance. But I guess as an attorney and active in these cases, what strikes me is it's it's not enough just to say that Madison and Jefferson advocated for the separation of church and state, but to recognize the difficulty of applying the principles that our founding generation gave us as the foundation of a liberal democracy, of a nation where that protects all of our rights, including our religious freedom rights. The difficulty of applying those principles in the modern context and using that history as the basis for judging. So,
Yeah.
wonderful talk with, and I've known Steve as he said for decades now, and he's been doing fantastic work.
And so, Alan, yes, what I took away from it is that Shakespeare was spot on when he said past is prologue. If we really want to understand our current debates that we're having today on any issue of public policy, and especially on the role of religion in our republic, then, turning the microscope back onto our past is really the only way that we can understand what's going on around us today.
Well, that's our show for today. This has been Just Liberty. Thanks for joining us. I'm Alan Reinach with my very wonderful co-host, Bettina Krause. Remember, folks, eternal vigilance will always be the price of liberty. So stay informed, stay tuned. Join us next time.